Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Fair Housing Workshop. Thank you for attending. This event is being hosted by BU-GATA. I want to thank you so much. It's one of the best nonprofits that help us here in Arlington County, uh, with the housing division, and in this workshop. And this is something that I believe is very, very important because fair housing uh, is important to give people the right to live where they choose. It's also an important tool to eliminate discrimination in housing. So it is very, very important. And with the new class protected classes is going to be even very we're gonna have fun for the next couple of years. I'm telling you. So please take it nice. So having said that, for all of you that are right now with thank you so much. I want to invite you to an event that Arlington County is also hosting with Resilient Virginia in May. Is the Arlington Home Show and Garden Expo. We did it for 13 years in live, but last year, due to the pandemic, we have to do it now virtually. Hopefully next year we're gonna come back. And the main future is that we're gonna have 10 excellent workshops there, and all are gonna be housing related, especially the one here, the small landlord seminar on Saturday, May 22nd. That's gonna be 2 hours by a lawyer talking about tenant landlord relationships. We also have on Sunday, Mr. Dave Daly is going to be a class about your home making you sick. This is something about indoor air quality. Now that we are more inside the house, something could be making you sick. So you really want to find out what is the situation there. And also we have you're going to be doing any remodeling here in this springtime or the summertime, which is the perfect time to do remodelings. You're going to have all these contractors. All right. So having said that, thank you again for attending. We are recording this event. Your microphone is going to be turned off, same thing as your camera. The question and answers will be at the end when the presenters tell you, okay, I'm ready for question. And please, or you can start putting the questions in the chat. We'll be fine. We're going to monitor that. If we are not able to get to all the questions, probably we're going to email it back to you. And if you need to see, you please request that in the chat. And you are going to be able to see this presentation again at the arlingtonlive.org. That's the event that we have last October. We have wonderful videos there too, and you're going to be able to see it. I'm going to be sending you also a survey and also all the information that I present to do, a flyer about the event and maybe about Arlington Live. Having said that, we have today the wonderful, I believe, the best presenter for fair housing in the Northern Virginia and in all Virginia area, Molly Driden Mason. She is a fair housing training specialist with the Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation. Having said that, Molly, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me pull my little screen up so that I can do my thing too. Okay. All right. So good evening, everybody. This is my second class for the day. I had an hour and a half break, but hey, it's fair housing, and I get excited about sharing fair housing. So today we're going to talk about the Virginia law, but we'll also talk about the federal law because they go hand in hand. I don't need to go through all that slide there. As Jorge told you, my name is Mahalia Dryden Mason, but that's just too much to remember. So I just go by Molly, and I'm the Molly with an A. I'm not the moldy Molly, I'm the hot tamale, and I love fair housing. I work for DPOR. It is the agency that regulates everything that is not legal, financial, or medical. So we have contractors, lead workers, asbestos workers, hairdressers, nail technicians, you name it, we regulate it. We are unusual. because we have a fair housing office with a regulatory agency rather than a human rights or an equal rights agency. And that's because here in Virginia, that agency actually regulates the real estate industry, and therefore they inherited the Fair Housing Office. A little disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, and even if I was a lawyer, I can't give you legal advice. What I do is tell you what the law says. If you need to get legal advice, we suggest always that your legal team has somebody with fair housing experience, because one thing about fair housing, the punishments, there are no caps. The sky's the limit as far as payment is concerned. So the last thing you want to do is be in a business where you expect to be successful and make money, and you turn around and have to pay that money out because you didn't follow the rules. So today's topic is going to involve both laws, the Virginia and the federal law. But before we even get into the fair housing law, one of the things I want to do is bring to your attention a little thing called implicit bias. Some may say, I don't have that. Some may agree that they too have it. So for those of you who have no idea what implicit biases may be, this is about the teachings, the experiences, the environmental and social influences that have affected your life. It usually lies beneath the surface, but when there is any type of controversy, conflict, or disagreement, sometimes those uglies surfaced. We call them implicit bias, or we call it microaggression. And in this photo here, you can see what we're talking about. Instead of people doing what they did as young people, and when we were young and we wanted to know something, we asked a question. What we do as elderly is either talk to a person that's with us about the person, and we end up making up things that we think they're about rather than asking. In this case, you have a young person with a hijab on, and the media has influenced us enough to feel like anybody with a hijab or anybody that looks Arabic might be scary. Well, all they had to do was just say hello. Hello is universal. A lot of people answer back to it. And the way you ask the questions, you'll get the answers, back from there. Now, ignorance is one of the things that really and truly cause us to get involved in discrimination. One of the things that I wanted to make sure we had was a background as to why we even have this law today. I think this course has been taught many times, but people just got into the meat and potato of the laws without even explaining. And for some that cannot understand that people are being discriminated against, it is necessary to give them a little background. So I would always give history. Today is very limited, so I'm not going to go into too much of the history of it. But what I would say is that land is a very, very important thing. For years, we always thought that stocks and bonds were the way that we made money. But as time goes and we realize that with the Industrial Revolution, one of the things that really changed for us was the ability to own land and be able to make money off it. So you have this country where new settlers came. New settlers saw people that were here already, but they also were able to take advantage of something that happened when those native people saw them for the first time. When those native people thought that the gods had sent them because the sun was behind them and they were coming over the mountain. And when these natives saw them, they were so excited. They welcomed them. They taught them how to hunt. They taught them how to plant that little thing called a corn and turn that corn into stalks of corn that could feed them. But unfortunately, they didn't get a good thank you from those settlers. What they found themselves in was those settlers taking over their land, those settlers taking their children away from them and giving them to white families to raise so that they would have culture, even though they had their own culture where the woman was the head because the woman was the giver of life. They also thanked them by giving them blankets filled with smallpox. Those blankets infected them because their immune system was not capable of fighting those off. They were also raped and murdered. And as that population diminished, I guess somebody had to do the work for the settlers. So they went and they got another group of people and brought them here under the most horrible conditions. And even worse when they got here, because those people never knew that they would be treated as animals, thought of as animals, put down. A war came to fight what we know as the torture and extinguishing of blacks in slavery. Then came the wonderful emancipation that many of the slaves didn't know happened for 2 years, so that those who were owners of slaves could make sure that they planted enough and sowed enough so that they would have food set aside. As I said, somebody had to do the work. And even when they were freed, they weren't free, because if you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, you know that that piece of paper meant nothing to them. The Chinese came here. To do a job. They too were treated as differently. The Mexicans that were here, because the Mexicans owned small pieces of land of this country like Texas and California and New Mexico and Arizona and Nevada. So we started getting all these laws, and those laws were designed to do exactly what they wanted them to do. 1862, 2 laws were written. Land Grant Act that wanted to establish colleges that were specializing in mechanical arts and agriculture. The Homestead Act knew that so many people were settling on the East Coast of the country. So they wanted to encourage people to take advantage of the vast amount of land that there was. So they encouraged them to move west so that they could use up 160 acres of public land. They sold them this land pennies to the dollars with the condition that they only had to live there for 5 years and that land would be theirs. The Indian Removal Act. Historians have said that it gave the president the authority to negotiate the removal of southern native tribes west of the Mississippi. Well, those same historians says it wasn't a negotiation. It was pretty much genocide. So many were killed off for the purpose of taking that land. Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow kept trying to really convince people that even though we were not living in adjacent areas, even though we couldn't see what each other was probably doing, that you didn't have to worry about it. We were separate, but we were living equal lives. Well, to many of those people of color, that was a joke because they knew they couldn't just go anywhere and live because there's a possibility they could be harmed, even killed. They knew that they couldn't be in sundown cities when the sun went down unless they had important business that they were doing and they had somebody to vouch for them, or else it could have been their life. They knew that they couldn't go on a bus and sit anywhere that they wanted to sit. And if there were no seats in the back and there were seats in the front, they were going to have to stand up. They knew that if they wanted an education, especially if you were out here during that time when Farmville lost out on having people graduate because white parents did not want their white children going to school with little black children. The people in Farmville missed out on having their graduation and a full education because of that. The schools did not have enough people to maintain it being open. Governor McAuliffe, former governor, was the one who gave those folks that were denied an education their diploma about 5 or 6 years ago. Marriage, something that a lot in the African American communities are oftentimes criticized about, yet people seem to have forgotten that the opportunity to get married was not afforded to them. They created their own way of sealing relationships. It was called jumping the broom. But then if you were, out of your mind, according to some, and decided to get married out of your race, it could mean jail time. Just ask the folks in Caroline County, the Lovings, white man in love with a black woman that was part Native American. And when they got married, what a shock to see the police busting into your marital room to grab you and take you to prison, and to have a judge say that the mixing of the race was an abomination. Because of that loving family today, marriage is afforded to many who never had the opportunity to get married. Jim Crow laws. You may have been the most educated person, but you may have to be working in servitude. Homeowners Loan Corporation, 1933, and National Housing Act, 1934. This was due to the Depression. People were losing their homes. Rather than have them lose their homes, what FDR did was to make sure that mortgage companies would be willing to refinance those homes so that those people would not lose their homes. Does it remind you of anything that we've been through before? Because we've been here in 2008. Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese weren't allowed to migrate here, but they were allowed to come here and build that railroad. To help the Chinese build the railroad, they brought another group of people, a group of people that they call the Black Europeans. Black, used as a derogatory word. Those people that I'm talking about are the Irish. They came here, some of them as indentured servants. They were in better situation because at least an indentured servant could either service time or pay his way out of servitude. Unlike the Africans who were enslaved, and the only way you could be let out of slavery is if you were given your freedom paper, which wasn't really free. Social Security Act. Again, FDR, very much a Republican, but always thinking about the people. FDR said, when we get old, we need to have something so that we are not struggling and poor when we're old. He's probably rolling over a few times in his grave trying to figure out what happened. Because one thing about Social Security, it didn't keep up with the cost of living, which has gone extraordinarily out the park. Japanese internment camp, 1942 through 1946. 4 years, if you were Japanese, looked Japanese, spoke Japanese, when Pearl Harbor bombed, was bombed by the Japanese, then every Japanese became enemy. And they were the people that tried their best to look like and be like the settlers so that they could also receive citizenship here. but were constantly denied. The one thing that the Japanese can say, though, is that of all the people that may have dealt with some wrong here, they are the ones that at least have gotten an apology and some type of compensation for the pain and suffering that they have been through. Urban Renewal Act and the Model City Acts, this was about building those powerful communities, but they didn't have that community to look like it looks today. Basically, when they were looking at these powerful communities, they were white communities only. And then you have the National Highway Act. This gave the president, again, authority, this time to take property so that the country could build highways for the defense of the country just in case we were attacked. Well, sadly, a lot of those places that they took were well-to-do African American communities. I believe it was Sunday, one of my church sisters was sharing with me that there was a Baptist church in the Richmond area that was on the line of the property that they were trying to take, and they had to fight to keep that Baptist church where it's at. So there's a part of the 95 highway that takes a little curve and turn because of that Baptist church. But many of those places in Navy Hill area in Richmond, where there was a burial ground, and the only thing that tells you that a burial ground was there is a little marker that's up under the parking area of the property management company. So when people talk about, Blacks have been struggling all their lives, that's not true, because there were very well, established communities in Oklahoma, in Chicago, in New York. Harlem was the place to be. So we had a lot of representation. So the person that we find to be a very much the mover and shaker in the fight for fair housing was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King didn't ask about equality. Dr. King has never said that all we want is equality. He said what we want is freedom. The freedom to come and go, the freedom to do as others do, the freedom to purchase a home wherever we want to purchase that home because we have the money to do so, the freedom to go on trips. But he said, this is not something that is afforded to all. And he said, until we are able to do this, we will never be able to succeed. So he walked in Chicago, marched so that they could talk about fair housing, but people didn't want to hear it. The mobs would oftentimes attack them with sticks and stones, beating them up, injuring them, sending them to the hospital, but they did not stop. And Martin Luther King was so far ahead of his time. I just love when you talk about discrimination and the first name that comes up is Martin Luther King. But what many don't realize is that he is used now. Before, when he was fighting all these injustices, he was not a very liked person. In fact, people like the Kennedys were, ostracized and thought of because they agreed and they went along and they helped him to fight some of these injustices. So Martin Luther King said that a home is able to allow people to do the things that they may have only dreamed about. When they buy that home and they take care of it, they can grow equity. With equity, they can start a little business, or they can send their kids off to school, to college, so that they can be better than their parents were. They can go on vacations, they can have money to retire, or they can have money to take care of any emergencies that's around. And he said everybody should be able to do this. Again, so many didn't want to hear it. I found this nice little cartoon, and in this cartoon, they use the language of the 60s. They said here that Martin Luther King sent a large number of Negroes into real estate offices in Gage Park. When they would walk in, the person would greet them and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have anything listed." Once that group would get back to the office, he would then send his white staff to the same offices to inquire about housing. And they got the opposite reception. They were told, "Oh, yes, we have several things. Now, what exactly do you want?" So Martin Luther King did the work that he needed to do to give the evidence that there is discrimination taking place. But that was evidence that was known. So all he did was to just go through the process to give them documentation. He inspired two senators, Senator Brooke from Massachusetts, who was a soldier who was affected by the denial of him buying a house, even though he fought for this country, even though he laid his life down, and even though he was a decorated soldier. You see, America doesn't talk about the injustices that they did to soldiers of color. Those soldiers were also supposed to get their GI Bill, education, housing, and health. But whenever they went to use that GI Bill, they would ask them for so much documentation. They would ask them so many questions that many of them would be frustrated and give up and never use what was duly theirs. Senator Brooke brought his Italian wife back and probably had told her he was going to buy this house and how happy they were going to be. Sadly, he was denied. He ran for Attorney General, won. He then ran for senator, and as a Republican, won by popular vote. A Democrat, Walter Mondale, sad to say, he passed just the other day at age 93. But Walter Mondale was approached by another soldier, this one in Washington, D.C., a place where we have like 46% African Americans living there. And he couldn't find a place to live. Whenever he wanted to go to see a place, they would promise to meet him. They get there. Once they saw him, they'll drive off. They'll lie to him, whatever it took. So he called Walter Mondale and explained to him about what he was dealing with. So these two senators got together, introduced the bill to fair housing. Senator Smith was a judge from Virginia, a well-known segregationist, and he was in charge of the housing committee. He would forget the bill at home. He would not bring it out in open discussions. Every once in a while, he may show it, but it took the assassination of Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1968, and it also took for the African American community to go totally angry and to tear up so many communities. There was chaos all over this country, but it got the attention of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was the president, that instructed his congressmen and his senators that they had to do something to show the African American community that change was coming. That something became the Fair Housing Bill that was passed 7 days after Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 11th, 1968. Here is the actual signing. You have President Johnson signing the bill into law. You have Edward Brooke to the left of him, the very first person to the left of the president. And you have Walter Mondale directly behind his right shoulder and right next to Judge Thurgood Marshall. This bill was signed into law in homage of Martin Luther King because his life was sacrificed for some of us to have the right to choose and live wherever we are able to, because we were able to meet the requirements. President Johnson, as he signed the bill, stated that it proclaims that fair housing for all, and he had to Explain to all, just in case you didn't understand, all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life. Unfortunately, it is not a part of the American way of life yet, because if it was, we wouldn't need to have seminars. People would understand that whomever lives next door to them have the right to live there because they qualified to do so. If that person, they don't like them, that's fine. But you still have to respect the fact that they have the right to live there. Fair housing is not just about getting the place to live. Fair housing also includes that that person should be able to use and enjoy their home, the property, and all of the amenities that come with the property. So, fair housing is now 53 years old, pretty much a drop in the bucket. So I'm going to take you through the timeline because, as they say, in order for you to get protection under any type of civil right law, you have to prove that you're being discriminated against. So in 1968, when they first enacted the law, there were only 4 protected classes because at the time that was the discrimination taking place. So you had race and color to protect those who were African and those of African descent. That was probably 100% of the cases back then. People were constantly discriminating against those who were of color. In 1968, you had national origin because at that time, you have people who were born outside of the U.S. and those who are descendants of those born outside of the U.S. Now, funny thing, they have put the natives on this list. So is that supposed to mean that the natives are less natives than the settlers? Because many of these natives have never even left their land, furthermore, to leave this country. But many of the settlers were coming from a different country and their children are descendants of them. So it really shocked me. In this list, you also have the Africans, the Chinese, the Irish, the Mexicans. They were also being discriminated against. In 1974, just 47 years ago, what we received as women was protection based on your gender. It was the first time women actually had that strong protection, but there still continues to be discrimination. We still find it. Why? Because this is a male-dominated culture. When it comes to religion, 1968, religion meant that you were not supposed to look at a person's religion to qualify them for anything. Those forefathers, many of them being agnostic, were not crazy about including a religion. So they said, whether you have a religion or not, you're going to be accepted in this country and you're going to be treated equally. Well, when the Irish came here, they were also discriminated against because of their religion. And it's shocking that the settlers that came here and were discriminating against the Irish were the same people that were running away from a king that was discriminating against them because of them not wanting to follow his religion. And I think the forefathers must have had a lot in their mind because they made sure that they wrote in the Constitution that we're supposed to keep law and religion in separate places. But over the last 20 years, we just keep bringing them closer and closer and trying to meld them together. Familial status and disability. 2 things that we've been going through since the beginning of time. In order to populate the world, we had to have babies. But families with children are number 3 in complaints. We still have people that would rather not rent to families with children. I don't get it. The future, and we don't take care of the future so that the future would take care of us when we get older? I respect every young person because you know why? I'm getting older and I'm hoping that they will take care of me. So I'm going to have to look out and make sure that their rights are covered. People with disabilities. Disability doesn't even tell you when it's going to happen. It can attack anybody. That's the one thing that doesn't discriminate. It's been hurting people from day one. The discrimination based on disability is number one in the nation. It's number two here in Virginia, while race is number one here in Virginia. There are some amendments and enactments that we need to look at when we look at this law. Virginia law was enacted on April 7th, 1972. It was the General Assembly that signed it into law. Virginia is the first Southern state to have a fair housing law. They did it 4 years after the federal law. The next Southern state after Virginia enacted theirs 11 years later, which was in 1983, and South Carolina was 1989. The only state in the South that has not had a fair housing law of their own is Alabama. Now, Virginia was number one in Southern states. It was also number one nationwide to have what is called a FAP, a Fair Housing Assistance Program, where the government of the state has a law that mirrors the federal government, and they pretty much ask us to do the job that HUD would normally do within the states. So that's what our office does. We're also a state that now added more protected classes. In 1983, we added elderliness, but in 2020, we added source of funds, sexual orientation, gender identity, and veteran status. So we are now 12 protected classes and not 8 anymore. So our complete protected classes are race, color, religion, national origin, sex, elderliness, familial status, disability. Then we have source of funds, sexual orientation, gender identity, and veteran status to complete our 12. Just like the states were given the authority to enact their own fair housing law, within the state, certain jurisdictions can enact their own fair housing law. So we have two areas that have enacted theirs. Those areas are Roanoke and Fairfax County. In Fairfax County and Roanoke, they both have marital status as a protected class. For those who don't know, in the South, there is a law that says you shall not cohabitate if you're not married. Now, for some people that are very shy about getting married, that works for them. You know, like a Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn. They've never been married because they just feel like it's unnecessary. Now, if somebody were to call us, say in the Richmond area, and say that a landlord doesn't want to rent to them because they're not married and it goes against their religious belief, then that would be a fair housing issue because they brought in religion. But if they're just talking about the law that is in the South, there's nothing we can do. If it's happening in Fairfax County or in Roanoke, then they can actually file a complaint with those areas. It would have to happen in those counties, and it would have to be looked at by the courts in those localities. Roanoke also protects you under age. So between the ages of 19 and 54, there is no protection. So a young person calling us at age 19 and saying, you know what, I tried to get an apartment and this guy told me that he doesn't rent to anyone under the age of 21. It works everywhere except in Roanoke. The person, if they're in Roanoke, they can actually file a complaint in the courts in Roanoke. So there are additional details about the law that I'm going to share. One of those is the exemptions. And under the exemptions, basically, these folks are allowed to discriminate on less. And I'll tell you what the unless is all about. So the first one says that if a person owns 3 single-family homes or less, they can rent or sell to whomever they choose to without regulation. The second one was about Mrs. Murphy, and Mrs. Murphy was a little apprehensive about trying to rent to someone that lived in her building. And she said that she wanted to make sure that, she was surrounded by people that she knew, because she was afraid that she could be hurt if it was somebody that was a stranger. So they went along with Mrs. Murphy. This was 1968. We didn't have all these other extra um, shows like ID Channel and Oxygen and all that, where you see that most times is somebody close to you. So what they decided on was to say, if you live in a building of 4 units or less, and you are the owner, you will be able to rent to whomever you choose to without regulation. The next bullet says that if a family owns a single family home and they decide they want to rent it or sell it, they can do so without regulation as long as they do not hire a real estate broker or agent. If they have to hire a real estate broker or an agent, then that person would have to disclose 24/7 that they are licensed and have to follow the law. Now, can these folks get in trouble? Oh, absolutely. If they make a comment that is discriminatory, or they publish a comment that is discriminatory, they can lose their exemption. Like, for instance, for so many years, people used to write ads, and they would write things like no children or dogs allowed. That is discriminatory. So even if that person had that one place and they write something like that and someone was to see it, it becomes discriminatory to them, then yes, we can always file a complaint against them. Religious organizations can build up what we call non-public housing based on the religion. So a Catholic community can be created, and only Catholics would be allowed to live in there because they would be an exclusive organization. Now, they cannot discriminate against a Catholic that is elderly, or a Catholic that is using certain source of funds, or a Catholic that has children, or a Catholic that has disability. If they ever decide that the property isn't making enough money or whatever, and they can't sell these houses and they're going to open it up to the public, then the religion cannot be an exemption. They would have to be completely regulated under the law. Educational institutions have one exemption, and that is gender or sex. Everything else is still regulated under fair housing. Remember that your children go off to school, they're at school more than they're at home. So that's their place of living too, and they are regulated under the law, to the point where a young lady received a settlement of $140,000 when the University of Kentucky at Kearney would not allow her to bring her miniature pincher that gets on her lap, looks in her eyes, and calms her down when she has a panic attack. So they ended up going, well, I don't think they went all the way through the court. I think they went ahead and settled real quick, and it cost them $140,000 for that discrimination. I was really surprised when I realized that a lot of folks do not know anything about the individuals with criminal records being protected to a certain point under this law. You see, in April of 2016, HUD brought out a new policy that said that landlords can no longer use that one size fit all to keep people who have criminal records out of their property. The reason for that is that what they have realized that when you look at even the African American and Hispanic men, they tend to be in prison more than anyone else. So having that type of policy disproportionately affects them. I met a young lady that said to me, Miss Molly, I have a property where the residents of that property is 95% women. Again, you have a 13% demographic of people, and I'm talking about the African American community. And that demographic of 13% is occupying 40% of the prison system. There's something wrong. And you know there's something wrong because men have been released not being not guilty, but being completely innocent after serving decades in prison for things that they did not even do. I think the one that really got to me was the young man who was put in prison on death row for murdering his mother. Somehow he was blessed to get out of death row, but they finally got the evidence, and this man is not only not guilty, he is completely innocent. But he went in as a young fella, and now he's coming out as an adult into a world that he has. It's called 911 to get some kind of help. Unfortunately, the help that sometimes comes out to them is the police. And the police is not equipped to handle mental situations. So the first thing they do is handcuff them and take them to jail. When they get out of jail, they now have a record. With that record, if they were to try to find housing, they can't get housing. And we wonder why we have so many people with mental disabilities in the streets. So, what they have said, and I will share some of that information with Jorge. What they have said is what housing providers need to do is first qualify the person. If there's a criminal record, we're going to sit down, we're going to have a conversation about what that person did, how long ago they did it, and then the housing provider can decide from there, what they're going to do as far as renting to them. One of the things they suggested is like nonviolent crime should be at least 5 years, look back 5 years. Crime with very little violence, maybe look back 10 years, and etc. I have a couple of cases that I'm going to share in the information I'm going to send to Jorge. And when he shares it with you, you can read those cases, and it's there where they have the suggestion. There are two groups that will not benefit from this policy. Those two groups are anyone that has been convicted by a competent court of the manufacturing and distribution of a controlled substance. What they're specifically talking about is methamphetamine. And the second group of people would be anyone that has been placed on the lifetime sex offenders list. Those two are the two that will not enjoy protection under that policy. Over the years, Fair Housing has talked about harassment, but most times when we talk about harassment, everyone goes to sexual harassment. And yes, we've had quite a few of those. In fact, I have this case here where you had the people in North Carolina dealing with inspectors that instead of them doing their jobs as they should, they were offering mobile homes to these folks, making them clean the mobile homes and going there and demanding that they perform sexual favors on them. If they didn't, then it's a possibility they would have lost the opportunity to get a home. Many of these folks were looking to get their children back and needed to have a place where they could get them back and needed to have, a job. So some of them felt like they could not fight this anymore, so they just gave into it. one young lady moved away, but long story short, it ended up with a $3 million settlement. And now it was because the Department of Justice went down there and did their investigation and found that what these um, complainants were talking about was the truth. So thankfully, that case came to fruition. What they have said that many are dealing with is quid pro quo, especially during this pandemic. Some have approached their landlords and say, look, I'm not going to be able to pay the rent. I got laid off or whatever. And many of these landlords are in such a nice mood. They're just willing to exchange sex for rent or sex for maintenance. And that is not allowed under fair housing law. So they actually had a webinar about that type of sexual harassment. You also have some that are placed into hostile environments where they don't want to be part of this situation, so they harass them. They're constantly, trying to touch them or talk to them and share dirty jokes or entering their apartments without permission and all that stuff. So these are things that are not allowed under fair housing. These are policies that should be written. You should be talking to your residents, telling them that it's not allowed resident to staff, staff to resident, or resident to resident. There are consequences for those. And then you have to go into the fact that when it comes to any type of harassment, one of the things that Fair Housing has said is that sexual harassment is illegal, but pretty much any kind of harassment that you have to put up with on a property is illegal. So any type of harassment that a person is dealing with based on any of the protected classes is not going to be allowed in fair housing or on properties where, fair housing is the regulatory law. Retaliation and restrictive covenants are another issue for other issues in fair housing. The interference with the enjoyment of the rights of others goes a little deeper when you look at the federal side, that it says that you cannot threaten, coerce, intimidate, or interfere with anyone that is exercising their rights in fair housing or assisting others to exercise that right. So we know that in fair housing, sometimes the residents will find that there's someone on the property that they feel they can trust. In a case in, I believe it was Kansas City, there were 3 families being discriminated against because of familial status and their race. So they approached this young lady and, talked to her, and they said, can you help us? This is just so rough. And I guess they were trying to evict them and all that. So the young lady said, well, I can't get involved. I work here and I need my job. Anyhow, they went ahead and she told them, you might want to find a housing organization that can help you. Well, if you talk enough about what you're dealing with, somebody's going to point you to the fair housing office eventually. So they pointed them to the fair housing office. The young lady was asked to come in to answer questions. She didn't go in because the job wouldn't let her go, but then they subpoenaed her. And if you don't answer a subpoena, you can be put in jail for ignoring it. So she went in, answered the questions, came back. Somehow they asked her, very subtly, did you go? You answered the question, and found herself without a job. She became a party to this lawsuit that ended with a settlement of $2.13 million for her and 3 families based on race and familial status. When it comes to restrictive covenants, you have those that would say things like none of the said land, interest therein, or improvements thereon shall be sold, resold, conveyed. And they would spell out exactly who it couldn't go to. And they would put out there that, it could be blacks, Chinese, Mexicans. In this case here, you even have Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, and Syrians. These were used up until 1948 when a case went to court and the court decided that a lady wanting to buy a house in an all-white community could buy a house there. And I guess it angers so many people, but it became null and void that you could no longer use those types of restrictive covenants to deny people from buying properties that they could very well buy. Nowadays, those covenants are usually found in homeowners association, not covenants like this, but restrictive covenants, homeowners association, condominium association. And sometimes these groups forget that even though they can write their own bylaws, those bylaws have to be in step with the fair housing law. They cannot put discriminatory language in there. And if they do, and they are, complained about, they cannot get upset about that complaint. So let's talk about the protected classes under the Virginia law. We know that we're now up to 12 protected classes versus the 8 that we had before. So what is a protected class? The term is used in anti-discrimination law and in both state and federal. It is actually referring to a group of people that share a common characteristic, that because of that characteristic, they are in need of protection from discrimination and harassment. So we look at the list again: race, color, sex, religion, national origin, familial status, disability, elderliness added in 1983, and source of funds, sexual orientation, gender identity, and veteran status added in 2020. Let's familiarize ourselves with each of these protected classes, give you a short description of them and how you can discriminate. When it comes to source of funds, it was easy to say that you were not part of the group that voluntarily accepted housing choice vouchers. That was up until June 30th of 2020. As of July 1st, you can no longer say that. You have to accept housing choice vouchers, any federal, state, or local assistance, including cash, child support, alimony, foster care subsidies, Social Security income, and any lawful income or government assistance. The only way that you are allowed to deny is if the dwelling is owned by an individual that only owns 4 or fewer rental dwellings in Virginia, or if that individual is part of an entity and he owns 10% or less of the number of rental units in Virginia. The last one is if that person cannot get the inspection pass, the 15 days to pass the inspection, in order for the occupant to get use of their housing choice voucher, then they can deny. But if that same landlord, every time there's a housing choice voucher, he is saying that he cannot pass the 15 days, then we may have to look at something else, that it may be going on and not just the situation with the 15 days. Now, how can you discriminate based on source of funds? If you're putting out ads and you're saying things like, we don't accept SSI or SSDI, we do not have this apartment approved for any use of vouchers, we don't accept Section 8, those are discriminatory phrases that are not allowed in your advertisements. Someone that is charging higher rents, deposits, or fees just because the person is using a certain source of fund, or making sure that they tell them that they cannot rent, sell, or make available a unit because they're using a certain source of funds. If they're denying the use of the facilities, facilities may have a fitness center, they may have rooftop patio, they may have a pool, a clubhouse, and you don't allow those who are using source of funds to use those areas, that would be discriminatory also. If you're refusing to include a person's Social Security income When calculating eligibility for an apartment, that would be a fair housing violation. Uh, Steering people to less desirable areas of the property. There was a property a long time ago that built a playground way in the back of the property, and they housed all the families with children back there. The excuse was the playground is there. Well, no one is supposed to steer you on any property. A person that is qualified should be able to choose what property or what unit they want to live in. If you're insisting that a potential tenant has to have a job and show that they have a job in order to apply, that would be discriminatory too, because some people that are on disability cannot work while they're receiving that disability. So that would be discriminatory against them. When it comes to veteran status, up until June 30th of this year, it would be veteran status, where a person that is has served in active duty, whether it be military, naval, or air service, and were discharged or released under conditions other than dishonorable, were protected under the law. As of July 1st of 2021, we will now expand it and rename this protection to military status, which will include any military personnel in the reserves, in active duty, retired. If that person, came out because of disability, whatever it is, they're going to be protected under this law from discrimination. Sexual orientation. Remember that Lyndon Baines Johnson said, all human beings who live in this country. Let me explain something about sexual orientation. We've been having our wonderful series called Lunch and Learn with the Virginia Fair Housing Office. And we had Helen Hardiman from the AG's office come in and explain these new protected classes to us. One of the things that she brought with her was the gender bread, and the gender bread explained the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. So I, as a woman, I'm attracted to men. So I am a straight person or heterosexual person. Sexual orientation is about your attraction, who you are attracted to. So you could be heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual. As far as I'm concerned, you're a person. If I'm renting to you, are you paying your rent? Do you behave yourself, in a decent way around there? And what you do behind your closed doors is your business. Because all I'm concerned about, you taking care of my property and you paying your rent and you're not causing any turmoil. Other than that, there should be nothing else that we're worried about. Gender identity means that you could be born and anatomically you are one sex, but the difference between the gender identity and sexual orientation that is so major is that your brain dictates which gender you are. So even though anatomically you were born a female, your brain may believe or feel or know that it is more geared to male, because we are all born in the same way. And then I guess there's the X and the Y's that determine who we are. But that has nothing to do, the anatomical has nothing to do with the brain. Again, we're talking about human beings. And my thing is always ask them how they want to be referred to. And now people actually walk around with t-shirts that say he, her, she, her, he, his, and they could be looking female and want to be a he. So it is not something that people invent in their minds. It is something that they are, and we have to respect that. When it comes to race, it's the oldest way to discriminate. Yet people continue to do it over and over. Those who have experienced this type of discrimination never forgets it. It's going to always be a memory, and it's to the point where you can feel it, sense it, taste it. It's almost like you can touch that it's going to happen. Race was invented here in this country. Race is considered a social construct. It was designed to place people in social boxes. It was designed to hold them down socially and economically, with privilege going to one group above all others. It's part of the social fabric of this country. But Redmond Dane and Colfax, one of the most powerful civil rights lawyers there in the DC area, they have fought many of the tough discriminatory cases, went back to court in 2019, and they got the appellate court to actually have a decision that established landlords' duty to protect a tenant from racial harassment. What they said was, if a landlord who knows or should know about racial harassment of a tenant by a neighbor and fails to take prompt action to correct and end that harassment while having the power to do so, can be held liable under the Fair Housing Act. They continued by saying, with the objective of building a racially integrated society in mind, it would make no sense for Congress to require landlords to rent homes without regards to race, but then permit them to harass tenants or turn a blind eye when tenants are harassed in their homes because of race. So now we know. And it came a little too late for a young man, but at least hopefully it would protect others. There was a young man killed by an older white gentleman. This young man had just graduated from college, was moving into his apartment. The older gentleman let him know that he was not happy with him trying to move into his apartment complex, oftentimes threatened them. The young man went to the police station to get a protective order, was denied the protective order, and that man shot him 6 times, killing him in December of 2019, of 2018. When the decision is about color, we're talking about pigmentation. So many of us have different pigmentations. If you look at, oftentimes you look at an African-American family, you could find from the lightest light to the darkest dark. It's the same in many Hispanic families. You can have blue-eyed, blonde-haired people, and then you can have the dark black hair and the black eyes and the more caramel colored complexion. But Homer Plessy years ago got onto the first coach, the first class coach on a train, and was put in jail because Homer Plessy was 1/8 black. And they felt like that it was enough black for him to not be allowed to ride on the first class coach that was for white people only. I had no clue that you could be 1/8 of something and be considered a whole. These 2 young ladies here are sisters. They're twins. Same father, same mother. When they were born, Daddy said, oh, Mama, you got some explaining to do. It wasn't Mama that had to explain, it was Daddy, because that was all his DNA. And Daddy found out the truth about his family. They all mixed. And most of us are. But we look at color and we separate so many by color. When it comes to sex, there are many ways to discriminate under sex. First, you have favoring one gender over the other. This is a very male-oriented society, so we oftentimes look at the males instead of looking at the females. And a lot of these females are saying, well, wait a minute, what happened when the males aren't around and we've been taking care of business? What happened when we've had wars and the women have been the ones that stepped up and do the work? So in 1974, it was a fight, but they won the fight. I am woman, hear me roar. That was the song that many of them sung. And finally, we got protection, but it's still not there yet, because then banks turned around. The first one was Bank of America in Irvine, California, discriminated against the doctor that was on maternity leave, told her to come back after she got off maternity leave, and then they will close on her house for her. They paid her $20,000 and set aside $100,000 in escrow to cover any other woman within that area that was discriminated against. And then you had another doctor that went to Cornerstone Mortgage to close on her house, told the same thing. Cornerstone Mortgage paid her $20,000 and set aside $750,000, which gives me the impression that they had discriminated against several women over a period of time. Wells Fargo, my bank that I bank at, paid the most up to now. They paid $20,000 to 75 women. They set aside $5 million to cover that. If it is not enough, and if there are other victims that show up, they have agreed to introduce another $1.5 million, bringing it to a total of $6.5 million to cover anyone that they have hurt because of this policy. So if you know anyone that is getting ready to buy a house and they're pregnant, make sure that you let them know that if they have any issues with closing while they're pregnant, that the Fair Housing Office is there to hear their issue. We talked about sexual harassment. Just want to remind people, update those policies, remind your workers about their behavior. If you speak to one, speak to all. Be courteous. Don't go into anyone's apartment unless you have a work order before you go in there. I don't care if that person is your best friend. There was a young lady who called someone up to her apartment. They went in there. This young lady was having problems with the property anyways. And when the guy, something he was going to go back to the shop to get and return, and she called the office to tell them that he tried to sexually harass her. Do not go in. If there is a child home alone, you should not be in any apartments if there is only a resident under the age of 18 in that apartment. So make sure that your policy as far as taking care of work orders are updated, and that they know in order to have a work order taken care of, they have to call the office to set up the work order. Domestic violence is another area where we protect, because 88% of those who are victims and survivors of domestic violence are women. What happens is they end up being evicted, and it is the number one reason why we have homelessness in America. What they have said is you cannot evict a victim or survivor of domestic violence. What you have to do is you may have to maybe change her locks, and if she wants to move and maybe go to a sister apartment, those things can happen. She brings you that protective order. Once she brings you that protective order, those things can take place. Every October, we have had a fair housing and domestic violence event. I am hoping that this year it would be the very first event that I can do in person. I want to be able to bring some psychologists and to talk to us about people who are hurt by domestic violence. One of the things that I know take place in fair housing is that the ACLU are the ones that have been handling the domestic violence cases and being very successful at them. Children and familial status are the number 3 in complaints. One of the links that I have that will be shared with Jorge is one from a landlord here in Virginia that sadly, that landlord passed just about a week ago. But she was a landlord that was complained about. They ended up talking to her on the phone, and she said things like, I'd rather have 10 adults than one child in my property. And she definitely said that she didn't care, but she knows about fair housing. She don't care. She gonna do whatever she has to do, and it resulted in a $25,000 settlement. And sadly, she had another case waiting for her. So I have no idea what happened, but sadly, she is not around. But I'm sure that case will probably still take place. So families under the age of 18, and I always take around this wonderful rule that talks about children have to be supervised while playing outside, but then the next sentence to it talks about no sports activities, skateboarding, rollerblading, or general extracurricular activities are to take place in our community. So what are the kids supposed to do? What I love about fair housing is that it has a great sense of humor, because the punishment for this was for them to build a $10,000 accessible playground that would be the enjoyment of children with disabilities and without disabilities. So if they didn't want people to know that children were in that neighborhood, oh, there's a nice big playground sitting out there right now. Families with children include single parents, adoptive parents, foster parents, grandparents, pregnant women, and anyone seeking legal custody of a minor. The challenges for families with children is stuff like occupancy, where a long time ago in 1991, you had people complaining because landlords still were trying to make it hard for families to get uh, apartments to live in. They wanted each person to have a bedroom of their own. Well, if you have uh, a couple, that's not so hard. And that time, you talking 1980s and back, it wouldn't be too hard to get a two bedroom. But when you're talking 3 and 4 bedroom, it's like pull what they say, finding a needle in a haystack. There was one guy that told me his parents had 26 children, and in those 26 children, only 2 were a set of twins. So she was pregnant 25 times. Where were they going to stay if they had to deal with that one person per bedroom rule? So people were complaining to HUD, and Frank Keating and Sarah Pratt were in charge of the FHEO that time, and they authored what is called the Keating Memo, Keating Memo. You have to download the one from 1998 that is used in court cases as a guide to what HUD would be looking at if there was a case based on occupancy. And what that document says is that the most reasonable occupancy is to have at least 2 persons per bedroom. Why do I say at least? Because the document also says that if there are extra rooms besides the public and common use areas, those areas are your kitchens, bathrooms, and living room, then those extra rooms could also be used as places for them to sleep. It also says that it depends on the size of the room also, because one person needs at least 70 square feet to sleep in. 2 or more in a room need 50 square feet each. So the bigger the room, the more people. So I read this complaint in Idaho, where a mother of 7 wanted to rent a 4-bedroom house. The landlord said it was too many people for the house. It would be overcrowding. Well, if you do the math, 2 times 4 is 8, which is exactly what she has. But when HUD showed up to assess the house and see the possibilities, they found that this house had 2 living rooms and 2 extra rooms besides the 4 bedrooms that it had. So this house more than had enough room for her 7 children and even some other people. So What was most impressive about this house is that it was 4 bedrooms, 2 living rooms, 2 extra rooms, and only $1,200 a month in Idaho. So I told my children I'm moving. They said it was, they said, no way. Oh, please stop telling people about them not sleeping, their boys and girls in the same room. Housing providers need to stay in their lane. That is for a parent to decide, not for a housing provider to say that. There's a young man on a property that told this family, yeah, you qualify for a 2 bedroom, but you have a son and a daughter. You need to have a 3 bedroom because they need to have their own rooms. Because of that statement, that property paid out $15,000. Curfews should not be on the property. What properties should have is quiet time. Curfews are imposed by parents and government. Now, there might be a curfew in Arlington, in the city of Arlington, in the public and common use areas like the malls, the park, after a certain time of the night. Then if you are a young person, you should not be just out there with no one with you. So on the property is a whole different ballgame, though. That's a private property. And another thing that really tickles me most of the time is that some of these properties have that wonderful sign that says, no loitering allowed. How can you loiter where you live? And oh, by the way, we need to remember that fair housing also covers guests. It's not just for the people that live there. Their guests can be discriminated against also. Rules. One of the things you need to do as a housing provider is to ensure that when you write your rules, they have a specific purpose. It's for safety or health purpose. In the case of the pool, because a young person can be a certified lifeguard at age 15, you may want to say anyone under the age of 15 has to be accompanied by an adult. That adult could be their parents, their grandparents, their sibling that is 18 years old, a family friend that is 18 years old, or a neighbor. So yes, in that case, there was a reason and a justification for that rule. If you want to have a rule for your fitness center, the manufacturer would tell you who that equipment is best constructed for a specific demographic to use. If they're going to use the equipment, up to what age should they have supervision? More than likely, they would tell you in all the paperwork that they send. And what you'll do is, if you're under the age of 14, you have to be accompanied by an adult when using this equipment by the suggestion of the manufacturer. So it's not the property saying it, it's the manufacturer saying it. Or follow what the YMCA does. Because the YMCA, you cannot use the weights and all that by yourself until you're 14 or in high school. National origin, let me just say that language and national origin go hand in hand. When it comes to language, it identifies pretty much where the possibility of where you are from. Some people think that when you come to America, you put your feet down on the soil here, automatically you speak the language. But they forget that when they travel, they have to have their nice little translators and all that with them. So anyhow, there was a property in Virginia Beach that said that you could not even get an application unless you were able to read, write, and speak English. Well, that wonderful property got a surprise when they told them that, they had a complaint against them, and they ended up paying $75,000 distributed amongst 3 organizations to do training in Spanish for a Spanish-speaking community. So great sense of humor. No one should be denied housing because of a chosen religion. In fact, we made it clear that religion has nothing to do with your being in a house. So if there's overt discrimination against members of a particular religion, or zoning is saying that you can't use your private home to have to use as a place of worship, those are things that fair housing would frown upon. We also look at shelters that want people to participate in religious activities in order to get service. That is a big no-no. Elderliness, here we have the Housing for Older Persons Act that was enacted back in 1995. If you wanted to be an elder community, you had to sign up then and grandfather in. Now we have two types of elderly communities. There's the 62 and older community, where you have to be 62 and older to actually live there, or you have the 55 and older community that says at least one person needs to be 55 and older to live on that property in that house. The other 20% could be families with children. It could be people with disabilities. It's really up to the property. Each of these properties have at least 35 buildings up there, at least 35 units that would make up the community. That is part of the requirement from HUD. Disability. When it comes to disability, it's my favorite protected class. When it comes to disability, the first thing we need to talk about is what is the definition of disability. So we, instead of creating our own definition, just piggybacked on the Americans with Disabilities Act. They expanded their definition, and so that's what we base ours on. It says that you have to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So it's not sufficient with just having the condition. That condition has to limit one or more major life activities, like diabetes. In order to be considered a person with disabilities, you can have diabetes, but that diabetes have to affect your eyesight, or affect your kidneys, or affect your circulation to where they have to go ahead and amputate limbs. So those are things that would show that that person has a disability. If that person has a record of having that disability, and it can be verified by a doctor, psychologist, caseworker, social worker, peer support group, and one group that is that family member that is the actual caregiver for that person with the disability. For instance, a mother who has raised that child with a disability from birth would know that child more than any doctor would ever know them. And it would also give you more information than you even need, or that fair housing requires them to give you, just because they want to make certain that what they need is going to be given to them. The last one is my favorite of the definitions, because what it says is that you don't necessarily have to have a disability in order to be considered a person with disability and being discriminated against. If you have some different quirks that some people may consider weird, they may think you have a mental disability, treat you as such, and in treating you as such, they may discriminate against you. If they do that, you can file a complaint against them based on disability, even though you don't have a disability. And it's only because, as it says here, or being regarded as having such an impairment. So fair housing expects that housing providers make certain changes, adjustment, exceptions to structure, to rules, to policies, to service, to practices. This is known as the equalizer for people with disabilities. You see, many housing providers like to say, treat everyone exactly the same, but in treating everyone exactly the same, you will definitely discriminate against people with disabilities. So what they've said is, in order to give equality in housing, you have to make reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. So what are reasonable accommodations? According to the law, a reasonable accommodation can be a change, an exception, an adjustment to rules, policies, services, or practices. They can be, needed at any time of tenancy, because one thing with disability, it doesn't discriminate. the landlord or the housing provider has instances in which they can deny that accommodation. We will talk about that in a minute, but they have to apply it during the application, the tenancy, and to prevent eviction. Virginia makes it easy. We're changing rules, policies, services, practices. 504 says not only would you have to follow the fair housing law, if you are a federally funded property, you are also going to have to be regulated by Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, where federally funded properties also include structural changes in their reasonable accommodations. Now, why is this important to understand? It is because when it comes to private properties, they're only looking at paper changes with the exception of parking spaces that can be a slight modification if you have to cut the curb walk, but it comes hand in hand with the parking space so that the person wouldn't have to go park, but go all the way down to the end of the sidewalk to come back to where they live. In federally funded properties, any change that you make is considered a reasonable accommodation, because when it comes to reasonable accommodation, it is the financial responsibility of the housing provider. They have stated that in many of the cases that went to court. So if a person is applying or lives there and they have a need for a reasonable accommodation, they must first meet the definition of disability under the Fair Housing Law. Then they're going to ask them to show, if it is not readily visible, the relationship between what they're asking for and their disability. Like, for instance, a blind person would either use a dog or a horse as a CNI animal. Please remember that the threshold for showing causation is very low. So even though you are going to be asking questions, you have to be very careful about them telling you more than they should. And if they do tell you more than they should, you cannot share it with anyone else, because then you will be crossing over the HIPAA law. The request must be reasonable. We'll talk about what's unreasonable in a minute. The landlord has to enter into a conversation with that resident and listen more than they talk, so that they can hear what that resident's need is, and sometimes even give input about a different way that they could handle that request. In the long run, if the request is reasonable and it could alleviate what that person needs as being problematic to them, then if the landlord does not grant that request, they are running the risk of violating the Fair Housing Law. Now, what's unreasonable? In order to prove that something is unreasonable and you are not able to make that change, first you would have to show that the change has posed an undue financial and administrative hardship. Let me break that down for you. You pretty much have to show that you're broke and too busy to make the change. If you can't show that you're broke and busy, then you have to make that change. You can also deny if what they're asking you for is something that housing providers don't do as part of their business, like clean a person's house every week. That is not something that a housing provider does. That's something that the person has to do. But the housing provider can give them some hints about people that they can turn to for that service. The most popular of the reasonable accommodation requests is asking for assistance, emotional support, or companion animals. These animals are animals that serve a purpose. I have put all the names in this heading: service, assistance, emotional support, and companion animal. Under the ADA, service animals have to have a specific job. Service animals are also taken into public places. So this is public accommodations. The two animals that are allowed are dogs and horses. Dogs can tell you about a myriad of different conditions that a person has. But I never forget the young man that's 12 years old that wished he had never been born because he had diabetes. And he was tired of pricking his fingers and not being able to just play like all the other boys. Somebody heard his cry and brought him a golden retriever that is a diabetes detection animal. He's happy. With the horse grows no more than 36 inches tall. The smallest one to date is 14 inches. The horse started out being a guide for those who are blind, has evolved into helping people who have mobility issues, including pulling wheelchairs and helping those who get tired when they walk to have support that they can lean on and walk. The people in the little people community were the ones asking for the modification because they have a lot of issues with legs and backs and wanted, an animal that could be helpful to them. Under assistance, emotional support, and companion animals, any animal can be any one of those. So you have monkeys that can pick things up off the floor, turn on lights, warm food up, give you something to drink, a myriad of stuff. You have birds that can talk a person with bipolar disorder out of their psychotic episodes. Sadie tells him he's beautiful, to breathe with her, I love you. The guinea pig was one that the young lady in college asked her college to allow her to bring. The college told her no. She wrote us a letter. Someone called them and reminded them that it would not be too cute to have Virginia sue a Virginia state entity. So, and that this was part of the law and this had to be done. And now that young lady doesn't have to go home several times a week, driving 2+ hours to go home to get a fix. The potbelly pig that I met is named Tucker the pig. You can look him up. He's very popular. He was living in Brandermill. Somebody snitched and said, hey, we got a pig in Brandermill. The minute I heard it, I knew he was an assistance animal. I was able to meet the family and invite them to an event that we had and explain that they lost a child to cancer, very devastating to the family. And so they wanted to heal but not with chemicals. They wanted to do it naturally. They tried with a dog, but found that the dog was not a good match for them because too many allergies. So someone suggested a pig that was supposed to be only 90 pounds. He ended up being 250 pounds, but a sweet, sweet guy he is. The family has now moved to Powhatan and have a farm. I would not be surprised if they are going to start rearing these pigs themselves. So if a person needs an emotional support assistance animal or companion animal as a reasonable accommodation, they must first answer 2 questions. Do you qualify as a person that has a disability according to the ADA? The answer has to be yes. And 2, does your disability require the assistance of an animal? And it has to be yes. Once they bring the verification, if needed, then there's no deposit and no additional rent. That animal is as one with that person. That animal is going to do the things that that person cannot do. They do not need specialized training, and they sure don't need a certificate. Only verification that the animal does provide a necessary service to the person with the disability. They can be any size, any weight, any breed, but they cannot be a threat to residents or the property. You do have to put out rules because people will not do the right thing if there is not a guidance. Noise control, leash law for dogs, license and shot records have to be presented and clean up after the animal. Residents have to take control of the animal and be able to care for it, taking it to the vet, taking it to get groomed, feeding it. And they know that if there are damages above and beyond any normal wear and tear, they're going to be responsible for it. We do have guidances, and this will be coming with the wealth of information I will be sharing. Hoarding and the fair housing law. Hoarding is a disability. It is not a protected class. It's a disability. Because it's a disability, you can't just evict a person that is hoarding. So we know that 6% of the world's population hoard. We know anyone can be a hoarder, including children. Elderly women are more likely to hoard. They're not nasty, they're not lazy, they're not defiant. These folks have a disability that they will not ask you for reasonable accommodation. But because you can look and see that there is a disability going on, you're going to make that reasonable accommodation. And the way it works is, first of all, you're going to address the not so good housekeeping that is written up in their contract, in their contract for leasing. You have to keep good housekeeping. So you give them a 2130 saying you need to modify the home, clean it up, and bring it up to code in 21 days, or in 30 days, we're going to have to ask you to move out. Well, as long as that person that is hoarding is willing to work with you, you're going to extend that 2130 maybe to a 4260, to a 6390, and so on. Early intervention is the best offense. I tell people you have opportunities to inspect, you have opportunities to change the HVAC. If you are doing your work as you're supposed to, you'll be able to maybe catch some of these things going on before they get too bad and address them. It takes a community. It's not an easy thing to work with. Now, modifications are done on private properties. Modifications can come at any time. These are structural changes to buildings, units, the public area, or wherever that person may need it. They have to be reasonable, and they can come at any time of tenancy. The difference between the modifications and the accommodations is that in this case, in private properties, when you're going to change structure, it is the financial responsibility of the resident. And the housing provider can even ask that the resident restore the property back to what it was, but it has to make sense. Widening a door and making it narrow again makes no sense. But putting a vanity back in place after raising it up for a person that is in a wheelchair would be feasible. They can establish an escrow account, and when they pay their rent, they can put some money in the escrow account to offset the restoration. We also have group homes, and those group homes came because of the Olmstead Act. The Olmstead Act says it's time to remove people that have been warehoused in institutions because they have a disability, when we know that many of those folks can come out and work and have a normal life like anyone else. Group homes usually have up to eight people in them. They're considered residential occupancy by a single family, and they've received a reasonable accommodation because they usually say 4 unknown people can live in one house, but in this case, it's 8. The other industries that are regulated under fair housing is advertising. Be careful how you advertise. Under fair housing, your advertising should tell anyone looking for housing that they are welcome there. You want to talk about the house, not who should live there. Things like great kitchen, beautiful yard, stuff like that. If you're going to use pictures and you put human beings in there, they have to send a message that anyone that is able to qualify can. So I always say, you might want to use maybe a Native American man, white hair, sitting in a wheelchair, grandchildren next to him, dog next to him. Powerful, powerful picture right there, because it says anyone who wants to can, if they are able to qualify. The only thing I didn't represent in that picture was religion, but 11 of the 12 protected classes are there. When it comes to accessibility, any construction built after March 13th, 1991 should include things like light switches and outlets at a certain height, kitchens that a person in a wheelchair can move around in freely and use everything in the kitchen without it having to back out and go back in. several times. Same with the bathroom, be able to close that bathroom door. If the buildings have elevators, every single unit in that building is accessible. If the building doesn't have elevators, all your ground floor units are accessible, and they should be for people with disabilities. But if someone so happens to fall in love with it and wants to move there, they need to understand that if you need that place and have another place that they can move to, and you need it for someone with a disability, they will have to move out on their dime. $600,000 is what a property paid because they did not build their property with the requirements of accessibility. Mortgage banking and homeowners and rental insurance use what is called redlining. They draw a red line around on a map around a community, and what they would say is that that community is a risk to do business with. What is the risk? It is the ethnic makeup and the racial makeup of that community. So in mortgage banking in 2017, Housing Opportunities Made Equal sued Wells Fargo Bank because they were not closing on homes for African Americans in the Richmond area. And same Housing Opportunities Made Equal in 1998 sued Nationwide, won $100 million judgment when Nationwide would not sell policies that they were selling to white homeowners in the same neighborhood, same type of homes, same zip code. These things have not stopped. You would think that with such big judgments that over and over that folks would get the message, but unfortunately, we still see some of those cases come up with other businesses. So now we're getting closer to the end. We're going to talk about your rights and responsibilities and some of the helpful tips that can avoid some of the problems that people have with fair housing. First of all, ignorance of the law cannot be used as a defense. We're going to say, oh, you didn't know? Well, you're going to get to learn now, because after you get punished, they're going to send you to my class. That's like, I guess, the second punishment. But folks, review those policies, rules, practices, or services. It is important that you do that, because sometimes you write stuff up and you write it up. You write so much stuff that you are not reading it. And when someone else gets it, they may get a different message from what you intended. So I've always been of the practice of whatever I type up, I send it to someone so that they can catch my typos, or they can, enhance what I've done. You also want to let that legal team review it before you publish it out to anyone, because like I said before, if you publish anything derogatory, it's kind of hard to take it back. Even if you delete yours, it's still out there in the stratosphere somewhere, and they will be able to see it. So get the approval from that strong legal team that has some fair housing knowledge with them. All staff need to be trained. All staff. Owners need to understand fair housing. Upper management need to understand fair housing. You cannot give orders to do things and not know that you're saying the wrong thing. And then when your staff says, nah, I don't think we could do that under fair housing, it might be an issue. And you say, I don't care what fair housing says, then let's just wait till I get to the civil penalties and we'll see if you care or not. Establish uniform housing procedures. I had a young man that was very sweet young man, and he told me so happily that he loves helping that older lady on the property. And I said to him, be very careful, because, she may be the one that you're helping now, but somebody else may ask you for help. And depending on what the situation is, you may have yourself in a situation where you are being, accused of discriminating. So stick to what your job description is. And that way a person doesn't have to keep trying to, explain that they can't do something because someone else is doing it. Share information with your residents about the fair housing law. I cannot tell you how many times people have come up to me and said, you mean my housing providers supposed to know all this stuff? So why don't they tell us? They feel that you're keeping secrets. When you can put out information about fair housing, what it says to anyone coming into your office is that I am adhering to the fair housing law and I'm going to do the right thing. And that's what we need for you to do. You should have your posters up and you should also have fair housing information. The complaint process has a time limit. You have 1 year to file a complaint with our office, where our office would investigate and try to conciliate. Our office would also be the ones to give the final report to either the Fair Housing Board or the Real Estate Board, so that they can make a decision as to whether or not there is discrimination taking place. But if we get a conciliation, we don't have to keep investigating. If there's no conciliation, then we have to keep investigating. If the board finds that there is evidence of discrimination, then it goes to the AG's office. The AG's office is then tasked to take it all the way up to court if necessary. But they too can conciliate. If the first year passes, that person still has another year, but this time they would have to find a civil lawyer and file the lawsuit in civil court and share the whatever they get with that lawyer. With our office, they don't have to share. Whatever the settlement is, that's theirs. Now let's talk about those penalties, settlements, and judgments. Before April of last year, it was the civil penalties ran between $10,000 and $74,000. They also added injunctive and equitable relief. They had to change practices and policies, and they had to be monitored. They could also throw in court costs and attorney fees. Each individual involved in the discrimination can also be individually sued. Now, as of April of last year, those civil penalties increased tremendously. Now they run between $21,410 and $107,050, depending on how many times you violated the law within a certain amount of years. So one of the things that I remind people is that this law has no caps. Whenever there is discrimination taking place, and if it goes all the way up to the judge is going to ask that complainant, how did this discrimination affect you? And as they are explaining how it affected them, that judge is adding the monies up. So now I give you an opportunity I wanted to stay within the time, so I give you an opportunity to ask questions or concerns, and I would try to answer them as well as I can.
Excellent, Molly. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
There is a question here on the chat. I don't know if you can see it from Kathleen Dwyer. Do you see that?
No, I didn't pull down the chat.
All right, here we are. When it comes to domestic violence, if we learn that a tenant is experiencing domestic violence, do we have the power to do anything to help? Second question, what rules are we allowed to enforce when it comes to guests? And the last question will be, what were the two questions that needed to be answered by an applicant regarding when there was a service animals?
Okay. The first one. Sometimes some people, let me put it this way. A woman, it takes her 7 times before she leaves a domestic violence situation. Because remember, this person made them fall in love with them. They did all the right things. It's once they got married, then the uglies started to come out. By that time, that person has already been told that they are nothing. Nobody wants them. Who would want them? Anything like that. So their confidence and self-confidence is totally disseminated. You will find that in some cases you end up trying to intervene, and that same woman would fuss at you because you tried to intervene with her. For this reason why, because I'm not the expert on doing something like that, I am going to have counselors and psychologists this year at the domestic violence, event, because I prefer that expert to speak on this rather me. I have been in situations where I have witnessed or I have seen the result, and I opened my mouth and spoken to the person that did the damage. And I want you to know, though, that most of them are still married today, but I laid the law down. And unfortunately, in the cases, we were in the military, so they knew that if I opened my mouth to their commanders, there's going to be some consequences there. But in the situation, the only thing you could probably do is call the police and have them come. But then it's kind of scary too. So I would say, let me get a better answer from someone that, knows more, and I will get back to Jorge and he can share with you too. Or visit us in October, and whether it's virtual or in person, we're having that domestic violence event. Yeah.
Yeah,
Now, the
what
second
rules are
question.
we allowed to enforce when it comes to guests?
What rules? Well, if a guest is coming on the property and causing problem, that's one thing. But let me just say, I have had friends who have said to me, boy, I sure wish I knew about fair housing when I was dating my husband, because I'm light skinned and the landlord was fine with me being there. But then my husband came to visit to take me out one day, and next thing you know, the landlord comes by to visit me the next morning, and he's like, "You need to watch the friends that you hang out with." Did you get it? It's called
Yeah.
dog whistles. That person has color, and they don't want them on the property. So situations like that. Another situation, you have a resident that is being visited by their, let's say, sister. The sister has a child with autism. That child has a dog. Your property is a no pets property, but that child needs that dog. You cannot keep that dog off that property. It would be discrimination, because you're ruining the visit that person would have had with their sister or friend or whomever they are, by not allowing them to come on the property with the animal that they need to have on that property too. And that animal will have to follow all the rules, just like anyone else. Can't be jumping on people, stuff like that. But if
So
that
what we can
animal,
say is it's going to be case by case. Is
case
usually a tenant has
always.
to follow the lease, whatever the management had expressed on the lease, and it's also on the Virginia Residential Landlord and Tenant Act. Now, the lady also asked, what were the two questions that needed to be answered by an applicant regarding the service animals? I think on your presentation you say something about that.
Number one, do you meet the definition of disability according to the ADA? And it has to be yes. And number two, does your disability require the assistance of an assistance animal, assistance, emotional support, or companion animal? And that has to be yes.
Great. I have another question here. I believe is a little bit not related to fair housing, but it kind of. What do you do when you find out that there is a racial discrimination against your tenant by a neighbor, for example? I don't know what we will be able to do.
Oh, yeah, you can do. Come on now. If that is your property, you run that property. And if somebody is harassing, ask you to show me. Because if you're telling me you have a policy just to get away from me, I'm my mother's child. I'm from the show me country. Show me. And if you don't show me, you lied. And that already destroyed any relationship we could have. So you have to have those policies written up so that you can go back to your policy and say, hey, it's written in the policy here. And this is what. Okay, as long as that policy is not contrary to what fair housing is saying, yeah.
All right. Another question. The exemption to owners with three or less single-family homes,
Hmm.
that it also apply to condominiums, townhouses?
It's any properties that any
So,
properties you have to have three or less. So if you have a condominium, you have a home, then you have another house in South Carolina that's your beach house, and you have a house in California that's your other, your other house. All of those are properties. Now you're at four, you're not at three anymore. Anything that is deeded to you is what we'll find out.
all right. Another question here from uh, somebody. If a lender says that you have to have 36 months of alimony to qualify for the loan, does that discriminate
It
under
could.
the source of funds or
Yes.
family status?
I'm going to tell you right now that source of funds has no time limitation on anything, which means that for a housing provider to put time limitations on something, it is another way to subtly keep them out of the property.
Great. That's great. We are getting close to the end of the time, and
Mm-hmm,
uh, I want to ask you something to talk maybe for a minute
mm-hmm.
about discrimination under COVID-19. There is something that you've been hearing about related to that.
Well, yeah, I can't even go into a whole lot of detail, but I've had some people talk to me about kicking. They've been kicking out people because they have COVID and stuff. Um, in fact, today the secretary of HUD was supposed to be talking while I was giving my classes, so I missed out on her presentation. But I'm hoping that I get to see it. But what they've said is that during COVID time, one of the things that went up a lot was sexual harassment. And then the other thing that they talk about with COVID is people getting evicted once the housing provider knows. But when you think about it, that person has a virus that could be detrimental, and it would have been better for them to stay in the house and stay inside the house, and somebody bring them food or whatever, than to put them out. But let me again check into that and make sure what HUD is asking us to do about those situations.
So whoever start asking questions about that subject is yet to come, because it is going to be on the books soon, and whatever outcome comes, is going to be a yes heard in courts, and
Yeah,
then we'll see how it goes.
it
It's
turns
about
out.
people not wearing masks, about different other reasons, that people will take it as a discrimination in housing. So having said that, it's 8 p.m. I really want to thank Molly for this wonderful presentation. You are always the best, Molly.
Thank
I
you.
love you,
Thank
and
you.
we love you here in Arlington.
Thank you.
And we're gonna be see each other again.
Mhm.
Thank you, Saul. Thank you, everybody that participate.